In the modern NHL, there is perhaps no team that has had more consistent success than the Chicago Blackhawks. Since the beginning of the salary cap era, the Chicago Blackhawks have produced multiple All-Stars, a Hart Trophy winner, a Calder Trophy winner, and of course, teams that have won 3 Stanley Cups. But with a team that has such a bounty of talent, the question must be asked, what combination of players would make up the best team for the Chicago Blackhawks in the modern NHL? Today I present to you the greatest Blackhawks team possible in the modern NHL era, wherein I take the best seasons from Chicago Blackhawks players to combine them and create the ultimate team. Let's begin with the most obvious inclusion on this team. For the Chicago Blackhawks, their first line right wing will be none other than number 88, Patrick Kane, and specifically the 2015-2016 version of Patrick Kane. That was the year that Kane scored 46 goals and 106 points, leading to his first and only Hart Memorial Trophy win as league MVP. Kane set his career high in goals and points that year and his second highest assist total in his NHL career. But on top of that, he also was credited with having one of his best defensive years of all time, having 2.6 defensive point share according to Hockey Reference, giving him a total point share of 15 points, meaning that he accounted for 15 of Chicago's 103 points that season, a year that unfortunately saw them lose in the first round to the St. Louis Blues. And to absolutely nobody's surprise, centering Kane is the other stalwart of those 3 Chicago Blackhawks Stanley Cup teams, and the captain, Jonathan Taves. In 2012-2013, Taves put up his best point totals of his career, 23 goals and 48 points in 47 games. He was the Selke Award winner for the best defensive forward in hockey, and he accounted for 9.4 of Chicago's 97 points that year. And rounding out that top line, we have our first bit of controversy, not because of who goes here, but because this particular player could have fit in multiple spots on the lineup and done admirably, but ultimately that top line is going to be rounded out by left winger Patrick Sharp. While Sharp played both center and left wing for the Blackhawks, it was his 2013-14 season, which he spent most of the time at left wing, which gave him his best season as an NHL player. 34 goals and 78 points, to give him a total point share of 10. Although Sharp didn't win any major awards or get an All-Star appearance, he did help lead the Blackhawks to the conference finals, where they ultimately fell in a Game 7 to the LA Kings. So we have our first line, Patrick Sharp, Jonathan Taves, and Patrick Kane. No surprises to anybody else, and there will be few surprises when we get to the first pairing of defense, starting with the 2009-2010 campaign for defenseman Duncan Keith. Now, Keith was an absolute force for the Blackhawks, recording 5 of the 6 best seasons by a defenseman in the salary cap era. But in 2009-2010, he had one of his best showing. Not only did he have a career high in goals with 69 points and 14 goals, but Keith was credited as having a 6.2 defensive point share that season, his second highest total behind only the 2008 campaign, where he had a 6.3 defensive point share. That lockdown play, combined with his offensive onslaught that season, combined to give him a 12.6 point share, which led to him earning not only an All-Star appearance, but securing his first of 2 Norris Trophy victories for the best defenseman in the NHL. Oh, and of course that was the year that Chicago won their first of their 3 Stanley Cups during their dynasty run. And joining him on this top pairing is none other than Brent Seabrook. In 2015-16, Brent Seabrook put up his best numbers as a defenseman, scoring 14 goals and 49 points. His 9.2 point share was the highest of his career, and even though he didn't have his best defensive year with a 4.4 defensive point share, he still made up for it with outstanding offensive play. 2015 was also the year that Seabrook made his first and only NHL All-Star game, and while he didn't win any major awards like the Norris, he was an incredibly key contributor to those 3 Blackhawks championship teams. Now, before we look at our starting goaltender for these Blackhawks teams, let's actually go and round out the top 6 forwards, starting with the second line right wing for the Chicago Blackhawks, and in fact it will be one of the elder statesmen of those teams and a longtime Blackhawk, 2008-2009's Marty Havlat. Havlat registered a career high in goals and points, scoring 29 goals, 77 points, which made up a 9.5 point share for the year. And while he didn't secure any major awards this year, he did lead the NHL in plus-minus, which, flawed stat or not, is still a nice little feather in Havlat's cap. This was the last of Havlat's 3 seasons in Chicago, but he left them on a good note, taking the Blackhawks back to the playoffs for the first time since 2002. And even though they lost in the first round, it was the experience that this young core needed to kickstart their growth and begin that dynasty. Now, in searching for Hava at center, I actually realized that the Chicago Blackhawks over the years have had some pretty miserable center depth. In fact, if you could repeat players, Jonathan Taves would be the center on 3 of the 4 Chicago Blackhawks lines, the other center being Patrick Sharp. But since they're both accounted for on the first line, we must then go to the next highest rated center for the Blackhawks in the modern era, meaning we have to go all the way back to 2007-2008, Robert Lang. Now, this was Lang's only season in Chicago, and at age 37, it wasn't even one of his best years ever. He'd had far more productive years with Washington and Pittsburgh, but in 2007-2008, he put up 21 goals and 54 points for a 6-point share, which is unironically the best mark of any Chicago Blackhawks center of the modern NHL, not named Jonathan Taves or Patrick Sharp. And this was still in the midst of the Chicago Blackhawks rebuild. They did not make the playoffs this year, but they were on the uptick with 88 points, finishing above 500. But yeah, if we're trying to formulate the best Chicago Blackhawks team of the last 20 years, unironically, 37-year-old Robert Lang is your number 2 center. And then rounding out the second line, he was only there for a little bit, but he made quite the impact. It is the breadman himself, Artemi Panarin. Back in 2015-16, as a rookie, Panarin made an immediate impact in the NHL, putting up 30 goals and 77 points for a 9.8-point share. Panarin ended up being named the Rookie of the Year and almost made the All-Star team. He only lasted 2 years in Chicago before being traded away, but for the time he was there, he was an absolute stud. Next, let's move on to our starting goaltender, and the Chicago Blackhawks, so they have had a lot of very solid goaltenders. The man who edges out the number 1 spot is none other than 2015-2016 Corey Crawford. During the year, Crawford appeared in 58 games, notching a .924 save percentage, .237 GAA, and led all NHL goaltenders with 7 shutouts on the year. He received votes for the Vezina Trophy, finishing 5th in the voting and nearly making an All-Star team. His 12-point share on the year gave the Blackhawks the best goaltending performance they have gotten out of any goalie in the modern NHL era. Now jumping to the second pairing defenseman, and soup is on. It's Brian Campbell from 2008-2009. With a 7.8-point share on the year, Campbell made an immediate impact in his first year in Chicago, putting up 52 points. And while this wasn't Campbell's best season personally, he had much more productive years previously in Buffalo, it was still one of the best performances by a Chicago Blackhawks defenseman in the modern NHL. And he's joined on the second pairing by kind of a shocker to me, Erik Gustafsson, with a 7.7-point share in the 2018-2019 season. In his first full season of NHL duty, Gustafsson set a career high in points with 60 and goals with 17. Not only was it his most productive year offensively, but defensively, it was also one of his best years with a 2.2 defensive point share, one of the highest in his career. Unfortunately, Chicago also moved on from Gustafsson fairly early, and he has been kind of a journeyman for the last few years, even though his productivity could have warranted at least more than a passing look somewhere. Now dropping down to the third line for the Chicago Blackhawks, on the right wing, we continue to see their absolute bounty of depth, as their third line right wing is none other than 2011-2012 Marian Hossa. Again, this was not one of Hossa's most productive seasons personally. He had far better production in Atlanta and Ottawa earlier in his career, but at age 33, Hossa put up 29 goals and 77 points for the Blackhawks, putting him at least in the All-Star conversation. And while this season was a little bit of a letdown for the Blackhawks, who finished 4th in the Central with 101 points and bowed out in the first round to the Phoenix Coyotes, for Marian Hossa, 2011-2012 was still his best year for the Chicago Blackhawks, and it was one of the best years for a right wing that they have had in the last few decades. And I mentioned that the center depth was going to be a problem, and after Robert Lang, it got even worse. Their third line center for the Chicago Blackhawks is in fact 2017-2018 Nick Schmaltz. In his second pro year, Schmaltz put up 52 points and 21 goals, accounting for 5.2 of Chicago's 76 points, a down year after they finished first in the Central Division the year before. Now for Schmaltz, there was really no fanfare, and he'd end up being traded to the Arizona Coyotes the very next year. He has since outpaced those 52 points over the last 2 seasons, but in all likelihood, it would have been wise for the Chicago Blackhawks to hold on to him because they have just not had that good of center depth, and Schmaltz is in fact one of the best that they have had of the last 20 years. And on the other wing, we have the 2014-2015 season of Brandon Saad. In the Saad father's final year of his first stint in Chicago, the 22-year-old put up 52 points and 23 goals. While he would eclipse these point totals twice and these goal totals 3 times, these were his most productive years as a member of the Blackhawks, and they were one of the best for a left wing in modern Blackhawks history. We'll move on now to backup goaltender before we do the final fourth line and third pairing of defense, because after Corey Crawford, there were quite a few goaltenders that could have fit the bill for the Chicago Blackhawks. You had a great year out of Marc-Andre Fleury at one point. Niemi was an absolute stonewall during one of their cup runs, but the second best year by a goaltender in the Chicago Blackhawks modern era does in fact belong to the Bullen wall himself, 2008-2009 Nikolai Hava Bullen. Now in this year at age 36, Bullen only played 42 games for the Blackhawks and put up a save percentage of .919 with a .233 GAA. Pretty good, but not exceptional numbers considering his career. However, this was still during the years that the Blackhawks were on the upswing, not quite at the point of being a perennial contender, so Hava Bullen's exceptional play helped to buoy the team, carrying them into the playoffs and all the way to the conference finals before they lost to the Detroit Red Wings. Hava Bullen's 13.1 goals saved over expected was 9th in the NHL among goaltenders and put him in the conversation for a potential All-Star appearance. And finally, let's fill out the fourth line for the Chicago Blackhawks all-modern NHL team. On the right wing, we have the 2018-2019 Wonder Kid, Alex DeBrincat, with 8.8 point share. He solidifies the right wing as one of the deepest positions that the Blackhawks have had. His second year in the NHL and his second in Chicago, DeBrincat put up 76 points and 41 goals, his best totals in Chicago. He would remain a fairly productive member of the Blackhawks until he was traded in 2022 to the Ottawa Senators, who then moved him to the Detroit Red Wings, where he's been tearing things up to start this season. Centering him on the fourth line will be one of the heroes of the Blackhawks Stanley Cup runs, 2008-2009 Dave Bolland, who put up 47 points in 81 games and 19 goals. He accounted for a 5.1 point share of the Blackhawks' 104 points that season, most notably remembered for his performance in the 2012-2013 Stanley Cup, where he secured that clutch goal to help Chicago secure their second Stanley Cup. Bolland would go on to play in Toronto and Florida, but he never had a season where he recorded over 40 points like he did in 2008-2009, which makes him the fourth line center for the Blackhawks all-modern NHL team. And then finally on the fourth line for the Chicago Blackhawks, it's another young buck who made an impact in his first year before moving on from Chicago and bouncing around to the NHL a little bit. It's 2019-2020 24-year-old Dominik Kubel. He put up 30 goals and 46 points in his first full NHL season at age 24. He was on the all-rookie team and finished third in Calder voting. He had some pretty productive seasons in Chicago after that with 38 and 32 points, but he never reached those same heights in Chicago. With Detroit last year, he put up 45 points and 20 goals, but he's moved on to Ottawa this year, and he seems like he's going to sort of end up being a journeyman. But his performance in 2019-2020 is good enough to earn him the fourth line slot on Chicago's all-modern NHL team. And then finally, the third pairing defenseman for this best modern Blackhawks team contains two forgotten faces, the first one being 2007-2008 Dustin Buffin. Everybody forgets that Dusty Buff did get his start in Chicago before having his best seasons in Atlanta and Winnipeg, but in 2007-2008, Buffin had his best season as a Blackhawk, putting up 19 goals and 36 points with a 6.2 point share. Now we would have point shares over 8 and 9 for many years in Winnipeg and Atlanta, but unfortunately, Chicago did not have that many other good defensemen to fill out that third pairing, so even though Buffin didn't have his best year in Chicago, it was one of Chicago's best years. And he will be joined on that third pairing by none other than Nicholas Chalmerson. 2014-15 wasn't Chalmerson's best offensive year. He had only 19 points and 3 goals, but it was certainly his best defensive year as he had a 6.2 defensive point share, and he was in consideration for the All-Star game because of his defensive prowess. Now, this was, of course, the year of Chicago's third and final Stanley Cup win, of which Chalmerson was a huge part, so he earns his way onto the best of the modern Blackhawks team because of that defensive prowess, helping them to win a Stanley Cup. But Blackhawks fans, who do you think should have made this team? Let me know in the comments, and let me know if you want to see me do this for the other 31 NHL teams. If so, we can compare all 32 organizations to see who's had the best collection of talent over the last 2 decades. I'll catch you next time.